My name is Carolyn Masters. I'm 50 years old, and the man I trusted for 16 years looked me straight in the eye and casually destroyed our marriage with 7 words. I invited my ex to Christmas dinner just like that over morning coffee, like he was mentioning the weather. I should have thrown my mug at him right then. I should have screamed, but instead, I did something he never saw coming. I smiled, took a slow sip of my coffee, and told him that was funny, because I'd invited my ex-husband to. You should have seen his face. See, Stephen thought I was stupid. He thought that after 16 years of what I believed was a solid marriage, after working my whole life to retire at 49 with $4.1 million in the bank, after building this beautiful life together in our $1.2 million home in Seattle, he thought I'd just sit there and take it. He thought wrong, because when your husband casually invites his ex-wife to Christmas dinner and calls it charity, you don't panic. You investigate, and when you find out the truth of the affair, the secret apartment, the stolen money, the entire conspiracy to take everything you've worked for you, don't just get mad. You get strategic. That Christmas dinner became the stage for the most satisfying takedown of my life. Stephen wanted to bring his mistress into my home to evaluate my belongings, to play happy family, to set up their perfect little narrative for our divorce. But I brought something better than an ex-husband. I brought a weapon. This is the story of how one casual invitation, one glass of wine, and one perfectly executed plan dismantled a 2-year conspiracy and left 2 cheaters with absolutely nothing. It's messy, it's painful, and it's real. This is a long story, and honestly, I'll need someone to witness how it all unfolded. If you want to see how this Christmas dinner turned into their worst nightmare, stick around for what comes next. You won't want to miss a single moment. Let me take you back to that Monday morning in December. It was one of those gray Seattle days where the rain hasn't quite decided if it wants to fall or just hang in the air like a threat. I was sitting at our kitchen island, scrolling through my tablet, planning what I needed to grab at the market for the week. Stephen walked in with that specific energy he always had when he was about to ask for something. You know, the type overly casual, like he was working really hard to seem relaxed. After 16 years of marriage, you learn to read these things. He poured himself coffee, added that ridiculous amount of cream he always used, and then just dropped it. Said he'd invited Melissa, his ex-wife, to spend Christmas with us. Said it so casually, like he was mentioning he'd picked up dry cleaning. My stomach dropped, but here's what I've learned in 50 years of life, 28 of them climbing the corporate ladder to vice president of operations. You never show your hand too early. So I kept my face neutral, took a sip of my coffee, and asked him why he'd done that. He launched into this whole speech about how Melissa was going through hard times, how she was alone for the holidays, how it was the charitable thing to do. He even had the nerve to bring up the spirit of Christmas and forgiveness. His performance was almost convincing. Almost. But something felt wrong. Stephen and Melissa had been divorced for 12 years. In all our time together, he'd mentioned her maybe 5 times, always in passing, always dismissive. He'd told me their marriage ended because she'd had an affair, that the divorce was messy, that they hadn't spoken in years. So why now? Why this sudden burst of holiday compassion for a woman he'd supposedly cut out of his life over a decade ago? I asked him when he'd gotten back in touch with her. He said she'd reached out a few months ago, that she'd apologized for everything, that she was in a better place now. He made it sound spontaneous, recent, innocent. That's when I noticed his hand shaking slightly as he lifted his coffee mug. Stephen was a financial consultant. He'd built his entire career on staying calm under pressure, on radiating confidence even when the market was crashing. I'd seen him handle angry clients demanding explanations for losses. I'd watched him present risky investment strategies to millionaires without a single tremor in his voice. But talking about inviting his ex-wife to Christmas dinner, his hand was shaking. I didn't push. I didn't interrogate. I just nodded slowly and said that if he felt it was important, then of course she could come. I even smiled. Told him it was generous of him to think of her. The relief on his face was immediate. He actually seemed surprised that I'd agreed so as he kissed my forehead, called me understanding, told me this was why he loved me. Then he grabbed his briefcase and headed out for his morning appointments. The second his car pulled out of the driveway, I sat there in the silence of our expensive kitchen, staring at my reflection in the black screen of my tablet. Something was very, very wrong. I'd spent nearly 3 decades in corporate operations. You don't get to vice president level without developing a sharp instinct for when people are lying. And Stephen, my husband, the man who shared my bed, my home, my life, had just lied straight to my face. I knew it in my bones. The first thing I did was call my best friend Denise. We'd known each other for 22 years, ever since we'd worked together at a consulting firm before I moved to pharmaceuticals. She picked up on the second ring, and I told her everything: the sudden invitation, Stephen's nervous energy, the story about Melissa reaching out. Denise went quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She told me she'd seen Stephen a few weeks ago. She worked in a commercial building downtown, and she'd spotted him having lunch with a woman. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Stephen met with clients all the time, but the woman had been touching his hand across the table. Denise had assumed it was a business thing. Maybe a touchy client, nothing worth mentioning. But now, hearing about Melissa, she wondered if that woman could have been her. I asked her to describe what the woman looked like. Blonde, Denise said. Early 40s, maybe. Expensive-looking clothes, designer bag, confident, comfortable with Stephen, laughing at something he'd said. I'd seen exactly one photo of Melissa years ago, when Stephen and I first started dating, and I'd asked about his past. Blonde, put a ghetto, the kind of woman who knew she was attractive and used it. I thanked Denise and hung up. Then I sat there with my phone in my hand, feeling the weight of what I was starting to suspect. My husband hadn't just invited his ex-wife to Christmas dinner out of charity. He'd invited his mistress, and that casual Monday morning conversation, that wasn't an invitation. It was the beginning of something much worse. I didn't sleep that night. Stephen came home around 7. We had dinner like normal, watched some television like normal, went to bed like normal. He kissed me goodnight, rolled over, and fell asleep within minutes. Meanwhile, I lay there in the dark, listening to him breathe, wondering who the hell I'd been married to for 16 years. The next morning, after Stephen left for work, I did something I'd never done before. I went into his home office and started searching. My hands were shaking as I opened his desk drawers. I felt like a criminal in my own house, but I kept thinking about that tremor in his hand, about Denise seeing him with that blonde woman, about how quickly he'd seemed relieved when I'd agreed to Melissa coming for Christmas. The first drawer had nothing unusual: tax documents, old client files, business cards. The second drawer, same thing. I was starting to feel ridiculous, like maybe I was overreacting, when I pulled open the bottom drawer and saw a folder tucked way in the back, underneath a stack of financial magazines. The folder was thin, unmarked. I pulled it out with this sick feeling building in my stomach. Inside were credit card statements, but not for any cards I recognized. I sat down in Stephen's leather office chair and started reading. The card was in his name, but sent to a PO box I'd never heard of. And the charges, God, the charges made me physically ill. High-end restaurants I'd never been to. A jewelry store purchase for $3,400. Hotel stays in downtown Seattle on nights when Stephen had supposedly been working late. Charges at a furniture store. Monthly payments to something called Skyline Executive Apartments. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I pulled out my phone and called Denise back. Asked her if she could do me a favor. Could she try to run into Stephen again? Maybe see if he was with that woman. Maybe try to get a photo. Denise didn't even hesitate. She told me she'd make it her personal mission. 3 days later, my phone buzzed while I was grocery shopping. A text from Denise with 3 photos attached and a message that just said, "I'm so sorry." I stood there in the produce section, my hand gripping the shopping cart handle, staring at my phone screen. The first photo showed Stephen and a blonde woman sitting at an outdoor cafe, their chairs pulled close together. The second photo showed them holding hands across the table. The third photo showed them kissing next to a silver BMW in a parking garage. I made it to my car before I started crying, but I didn't cry for long, because something else was taking over, something cold and calculated that I recognized from years of handling corporate crises. The emotion could come later. Right now, I needed information. I drove straight to a private investigation firm I'd looked up online that morning, just in case. A place called Parker Investigations, run by a former police detective named James Parker. I'd read reviews from dozens of people who'd used his services for exactly this situation. James was in his 50s, professional, kind, but direct. He listened to everything I told him, looked at the photos Denise had taken, examined the credit card statements I'd brought. Then he told me that what I had was good, but if Stephen was planning something bigger, I'd need comprehensive evidence. I hired him on the spot, paid his retainer of $5,000 with a check from my personal account, the retirement account Stephen had no access to. James told me he'd have preliminary findings within a week. 10 days, maximum. He called me in 6 days. I met him at a coffee shop 20 minutes from my house. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table, and the expression on his face told me everything before I even opened it. Inside was my worst nightmare, documented in excruciating detail. Photos of Stephen and Melissa together, dozens of them spanning months. Getting into her car together, leaving restaurants together, entering a luxury apartment building together, kissing in parking lots, holding hands on the street, acting like a couple. But it was the other documents that destroyed me. James had tracked down their communication. Emails between Stephen and Melissa going back nearly 2 years. And reading them felt like being stabbed repeatedly in the chest. They talked about how in love they were, how they'd made a mistake divorcing 12 years ago, how they couldn't wait to be together permanently. Melissa wrote about how patient she was being, waiting for Stephen to leave me. Stephen wrote about how he was building their nest egg so they could start their life together properly. There were messages where they mocked me, called me boring, controlling, said I was cold in bed, laughed about how I had no idea what was happening right under my nose. But the financial documents were what made me physically sick. James had found bank records showing that Stephen had been systematically transferring money from our joint accounts into investment portfolios in Melissa's name. Over the past 80 months, he'd moved $238,000 of our money to her. $238,000. Money from my retirement, money I'd worked 28 years to earn, money from my $4.1 million nest egg that was supposed to be our future. He'd been stealing from me to build a future with her. The apartment charges on that secret credit card. Stephen was paying Melissa's rent, $3,200 a month for a luxury one-bedroom in downtown Seattle. The jewelry purchase, a diamond bracelet for Melissa's birthday. The hotel charges, afternoons when they couldn't wait to get to her apartment. James had even tracked Stephen's travel records, those business conferences he'd taken 3 times in the past year. Romantic getaways with Melissa. San Francisco, Portland, Vancouver, all of them charged 2 cards I didn't know existed. But the worst part, the part that made my hands shake so hard I almost dropped. The papers was an email exchange from 3 weeks ago. Stephen had written to Melissa about the plan. After the holidays, he'd file for divorce. He'd already consulted with a lawyer who told him that in Washington state, he'd likely get half of everything. Half of my $4.1 million retirement, half of our house, half of our assets. He wrote that the Christmas dinner invitation was strategic. It would establish Melissa as someone he'd reconnected with innocently, someone who'd been part of his life before, someone who could be seen as a friend. It would make their relationship after the divorce seem natural instead of suspicious. Melissa's response was even worse. She wrote about how excited she was to finally see our house, to evaluate what they'd be able to keep, to picture herself living in it. She said she couldn't wait to spend his money on redecorating. She actually wrote that she wanted to get rid of all my furniture because it was too uptight and boring, just like me. I sat in that coffee shop, staring at proof that my husband had been planning to destroy my life, and something inside me shifted. The sadness crystallized into something harder, sharper. Stephen thought I was boring, controllable, too stupid to notice what he was doing. He was about to find out exactly how wrong he was. I looked up at James and asked him if the evidence he'd gathered would hold up in court. He told me it was airtight. He'd documented everything legally, carefully, professionally. Any lawyer would consider it a gold mine. That's when I had the idea. I asked James if he'd ever heard of Thomas Brennan. James raised his eyebrows. Everyone in Seattle's legal community knew Thomas Brennan. He was one of the top divorce attorneys in the state, specializing in high-asset cases and financial fraud. He was also my ex-husband, and I was about to call him for the first time in 3 years. Thomas and I had gotten married young and divorced amicably 20 years ago. We were both ambitious, both workaholics, both more interested in building careers than building a family. After 5 years, we'd sat down over dinner one night and mutually agreed that we made better friends than the divorce had been painless. No drama, no fighting, just two people who genuinely liked each other admitting they weren't meant to be married. We'd kept in touch over the years, birthday texts, the occasional coffee when our paths crossed professionally, Christmas cards with brief updates about our lives. I knew Thomas had gone to law school after our divorce, that he'd built a successful practice specializing in divorce and financial fraud. I knew he'd remarried briefly in his 40s and divorced again, and that he was now happily single and focused entirely on his work. What I didn't know was whether he'd be willing to help me destroy my current husband. I called him from my car, still sitting in that coffee shop parking lot with James's envelope on the passenger seat. My hands were shaking as I dialed. Thomas picked up on the third ring, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it: warm, professional, with that slight rasp from too much courtroom talking. He sounded surprised to hear from me, but genuinely pleased. We made small talk for maybe 30 seconds before I told him I needed help. Legal help, urgent help. The warmth in his voice shifted immediately to focused attention. He told me to come to his office right then, that he'd clear his afternoon. An hour later, I was sitting in his downtown office overlooking Puget Sound, watching Thomas's expression grow darker as he read through James's investigation report. When he finally looked up, his jaw was tight with anger. He told me that in 23 years of practicing divorce law, he'd seen some terrible cases of marital betrayal, but this was particularly calculated and cruel. Then he asked me what I wanted to do. I told him exactly what I wanted. I wanted Stephen to lose everything. I wanted Melissa to face consequences. I wanted them to understand that I wasn't some passive victim they could rob and discard. Thomas leaned back in his chair, and a slow smile spread across his face. He told me he had an idea, a beautiful, poetic, perfect idea. And that's when he asked me if Stephen knew we were still friendly. I realized with a shock that Stephen had no idea. I'd mentioned Thomas maybe twice in 16 years, always just as my ex-husband, a lawyer in Seattle. Stephen had never seemed particularly interested in my life before him, had never asked questions, had never wanted to meet Thomas or know details about our relationship. Thomas's smile grew wider. He told me that gave us an advantage. He laid out the plan. I would go home and act completely normal. I wouldn't confront Stephen. I wouldn't give away that I knew anything. I'd continue being the boring, controllable wife they thought I was. But when Stephen brought up the Christmas dinner again, I would casually mention that I'd invited Thomas to. Just my ex-husband, come in for the holidays. Totally innocent, totally friendly. Stephen would panic, Thomas explained, because he'd have no idea what I knew or didn't know. He'd have no idea if I'd told Thomas about Melissa. He'd be walking into a dinner where a high-powered divorce attorney who specialized in financial fraud would be sitting across the table from him. And that psychological pressure alone would be valuable. But it got better. Thomas would spend the dinner casually mentioning cases he'd won. Conspiracy cases, fraud cases, cases where cheating spouses had lost everything. He'd make Stephen sweat. He'd make Melissa nervous. He'd establish himself as a threat without ever directly threatening anyone. And at the end of the dinner, I would confront them both with all the evidence, with Thomas sitting right there as my attorney. The beauty of it was that Stephen had created this situation himself. He'd invited Melissa to evaluate our home, to establish herself as part of our lives. We'd just be adding one more guest to his little performance. I asked Thomas why he was willing to help me like this. Professional ethics aside, this was deeply personal. This was him spending Christmas evening helping his ex-wife humiliate her current husband. Thomas's expression got serious. He told me that he'd always respected me, that our divorce had never diminished his care for me as a person, and that watching someone systematically rob and betray me made him genuinely angry. He said that if I was comfortable with it, he'd be honored to help me get justice. Besides, he added with that slight smile, it would be the most satisfying Christmas dinner of his career. I left Thomas's office with a formal retainer agreement signed and a plan in place. He'd prepare all the divorce paperwork. He'd document every instance of financial fraud. He'd prepare the civil case against Melissa for alienation of affection and conspiracy to commit fraud. And he'd prepare himself to play the role of friendly ex-husband who just happened to be one of Seattle's most feared divorce attorneys. The next week was the hardest of my life. I had to go home every day and pretend everything was normal. I had to smile at Stephen over breakfast. I had to let him kiss me goodnight. I had to listen to him talk about his day, knowing that he was probably coming from Melissa's apartment. He brought up the Christmas dinner twice more, each time with that same false casual energy, asking if I was sure I was okay with Melissa coming, mentioning how grateful she was, how much it would mean to her. I'd just smile and say it was fine, that I was happy to host her. The second time he brought it up, I was loading the dishwasher and I dropped it casually, like I'd just remembered. Mentioned that I'd invited Thomas to, said it had been a while since we'd caught up, and since we were having a reunion of ex-spouses, I thought it would be nice to include him. Stephen had been drinking water, and he literally choked on it. He asked me why I'd done that. His voice had this edge to it, this barely controlled panic. I turned around slowly, dish towel in my hands, and looked at him with perfect innocence. Told him I thought it would be fun, that Thomas and I had always maintained a nice friendship, that he'd been asking about meeting Stephen for years and I'd always been too busy to arrange it. I watched Stephen's mind working, trying to figure out if this was suspicious or just a coincidence. He asked me what Thomas did for a living now. I told him Thomas was a lawyer, specialized in divorce cases, actually very successful. The color drained from Stephen's face. He tried to backtrack, said maybe it was too many people, that Melissa might feel uncomfortable meeting both of us and an ex-spouse, that maybe we should keep it small. I tilted my head like I was considering it. Then I told him that was silly, that I'd already invited Thomas and it would be rude to uninvite him now, that besides, what was one more person? It would be festive. Stephen opened his mouth, then closed it. He couldn't think of a good reason to object without revealing his panic, so he just nodded stiffly and said that was fine, that it would be nice to meet Thomas, but I could see it in his eyes, the fear, the uncertainty, the beginning of suspicion that maybe I wasn't as clueless as he'd thought. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched Stephen become increasingly nervous. He'd look at me sometimes with this confused expression, like he was trying to figure out if I knew something. He'd start to say things, then stop himself. He became more careful about his phone, more secretive about his schedule. Melissa called him one evening when he was in the shower. His phone was on the kitchen counter, and I saw her name flash on the screen. I didn't answer it, but I stood there watching it ring, imagining her on the other end, probably wondering if the plan was still safe. The Wednesday before Christmas, Stephen asked me again if I was sure about having both Thomas and Melissa there. He seemed genuinely stressed. I walked over to him and put my hand on his cheek, looking into his eyes with all the false warmth I could muster. Told him I was absolutely sure that it was going to be a Christmas dinner none of us would ever forget. I meant every word. Stephen had no idea that while he'd been planning my destruction for 2 years, I'd spent 2 weeks building his ruin. And in 4 days, at our Christmas dinner, with Melissa evaluating my furniture and Thomas sitting across the table with a briefcase full of evidence, I was going to take everything away from both of them. The best part, Stephen had invited this confrontation himself. He'd set the stage, chosen the date, and handed me the perfect opportunity. All I'd done was add one more guest to the table. One very dangerous guest. The days leading up to Christmas felt surreal. I'd wake up next to Stephen every morning, this man who'd shared my bed for 16 years, and wonder how I'd missed the signs. How long had he been capable of this level of deception? Had he ever really loved me? Or had I just been a comfortable stepping stone to the wealth he actually wanted? But I couldn't let myself spiral into those questions, not yet. Right now, I needed to stay focused. Thomas called me 3 days before Christmas. He told me to meet him at his office. He had something to show me. When I arrived, his conference table was covered in documents, financial records, legal briefs, email printouts, bank statements. It looked like the evidence wall from a crime drama. Thomas walked me through everything methodically. He'd spent the past 2 weeks building not just a divorce case, but a comprehensive legal destruction. First, the the divorce itself. Washington is a community property state, which normally would mean Stephen got half of everything. But Thomas had found exceptions, big ones. The $238,000 that Stephen had transferred to Melissa's investment accounts, that was dissipation of marital asset. It meant Stephen had essentially stolen from our marriage to benefit his affair partner. Thomas explained that courts take that very seriously. When one spouse wastes or hides marital assets, they can be required to pay it back to the community before any division happens. But it got better. Thomas had discovered that Stephen had used our joint credit cards paid from our joint checking account for his affair expenses. Every hotel room, every romantic dinner, every gift for Melissa, every month of her rent, all of it was marital funds used for extramarital purposes. The total came to $312,000 over 2 years. Thomas told me that based on the evidence and Washington state precedent, he could argue that Stephen should receive significantly less than half of our assets. Maybe only 8%. Maybe even less. I felt my breath catch. 8% of our $4.8 million total marital estate would be around $380,000. That meant I'd keep over $4.4 million. But Thomas wasn't done. He slid another document across the table, a complaint for civil fraud against both Stephen and Melissa. He explained that because they'd conspired together to hide assets and plan the theft of marital property, Melissa could be held personally liable. She'd have to return every penny Stephen had given her, plus damages, plus court costs. And there was one more thing. Thomas had reported Stephen to the Washington State Department of Financial Institutions. Stephen was a licensed financial advisor, which meant he was bound by fiduciary duty and ethics standards. Using client trust even if that client was his wife too. Secretly move money for personal gain was a violation of his professional license. Thomas told me the investigation would probably take months, but if they found what he expected them to find, Stephen would lose his license permanently. I sat there staring at all these documents, feeling something fierce and powerful growing in my chest. This wasn't just divorce. This was complete annihilation. Thomas asked me if I was sure I wanted to go this far. He told me I could still do a quieter divorce, take my share and walk away without destroying Stephen's career. I looked at him and thought about those emails. The ones where Stephen and Melissa had laughed about how boring I was, how controlling, how stupid, how they couldn't wait to spend my money redecorating my house. I told Thomas I wanted to go all the way. He nodded slowly, something like respect in his eyes. Then he told me about one more element of the plan. The Christmas dinner would be a psychological operation as much as a legal one. Thomas would come prepared to be charming, friendly, and utterly terrifying. He'd dominate the conversation with strategic stories about cases he'd won. He'd make sure Stephen and Melissa understood exactly what kind of legal force they were facing. But we needed one more thing to make it perfect. We needed them to incriminate themselves further. Thomas suggested I wear a recording device. Washington is a two-party consent state for recordings, which meant we couldn't use secret recordings in court, but we didn't need to. The point of the recording was to capture anything Stephen or Melissa might say during the dinner that could be used to impeach them if they lied later in depositions. And more importantly, Thomas said with a slight smile, having a recording of their faces when I revealed everything would be priceless for my own personal satisfaction. I agreed immediately. The next day, Thomas came to my house while Stephen was at work. He brought a tiny recording device that clipped to my bra strap, virtually invisible under clothing. We tested it several times to make sure the audio was clear. Then Thomas walked through the house with me, and I watched his expression tighten as he looked around. The custom kitchen cabinets, the hardwood floors, the tasteful artwork, the furniture I'd carefully selected over years. He asked me if Melissa really thought she was going to live here after the divorce. I told him that according to the emails, she'd already been making plans about which rooms she'd redecorate first. Thomas shook his head slowly. Then he told me something that made my blood sing. He said that in his experience, people like Stephen and Melissa always underestimate their victims. They see kindness as weakness. They see trust as stupidity. They build their entire schemes on the assumption that the person they're betraying is too naive or too broken to fight back. And when that person does fight back, he said, The betrayers always crumble because people who build their lives on deception are fundamentally weak. They have no real foundation, no real integrity. The moment their lies are exposed, they have nothing left to stand on. I asked him if he really thought Stephen would fall apart. Thomas looked at me seriously and said he'd seen it dozens of times. The cocky husband who thought he'd planned everything perfectly, suddenly faced with evidence and consequences, just collapses. All that confidence evaporates. They start begging, crying, blaming everyone but themselves. He told me to prepare myself for that, because watching someone you once loved completely disintegrate in front of you, even when they deserve it, is still painful. I nodded, trying to absorb that warning. But honestly, I couldn't imagine feeling sorry for Stephen. Not after what he'd done. 2 days before Christmas, I went shopping for the dinner. I bought an expensive standing rib roast, fresh vegetables, a beautiful dessert from the French bakery downtown, wine that costs $150 a bottle. I was going to make this dinner absolutely perfect, because if this was going to be a stage 4 confrontation, I wanted it to be a beautiful stage. Stephen came home that evening and saw me prepping food. He asked if I needed help with anything, and his voice had this nervous edge to it. He'd been getting progressively more anxious as Christmas approached. I told him everything was under control, that I was actually looking forward to the dinner. He asked me again what time Thomas was coming. I told him Thomas would arrive around the same time as Melissa, that they'd probably meet in the driveway, that it would be nice for them to walk in together, both the ex-spouses reuniting with us. Stephen's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. That night, lying in bed next to him in the dark, I thought about the fact that this was probably one of the last nights we'd spend in this house together. After Christmas dinner, everything would change. I'd have to ask him to leave. We'd have to separate. The divorce process would begin. Part of me, a small, tired part that still remembered the man I'd thought I married, felt sad about that. But the larger part, the part that had seen the evidence and read the emails and understood the full scope of his betrayal, felt nothing but cold determination. Stephen had spent 2 years planning to take everything from me. I'd spent 2 weeks planning to take everything from him. The difference was, my plan was actually going to work. Christmas Eve, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to my safety deposit box at the bank and pulled out some documents I'd stored there when I first retired. My original retirement account statements, my stock certificates, proof of the assets I'd brought into the marriage. Thomas had told me these might be useful in establishing that much of our wealth was actually my separate property from before the marriage. Anything I could prove was mine alone would be protected completely. I stood there in the small, private room at the bank, looking at these papers that represented 28 years of work, and I made myself a promise. Stephen wasn't going to take my legacy. He wasn't going to take my security. He wasn't going to take my future. I'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and earned every single dollar that he was trying to steal. Tomorrow night, I was taking it all back, and I was going to enjoy every second of watching him realize he'd lost. Christmas Day started with snow, real snow in Seattle, which almost never happens. I woke up to white covering our lawn, coating the trees, making everything look clean and peaceful, and absolutely nothing like the battlefield I was preparing. Stephen was already awake, standing at the bedroom window looking out at the snow. I watched him from the bed for a moment before he realized I was awake. His shoulders were tense, his posture rigid. He looked like a man going to his own execution. Good. He turned around and tried to smile at me, wished me Merry Christmas. His voice sounded hollow. I smiled back and told him Merry Christmas, and that today was going to be memorable. I meant it in ways he couldn't possibly understand yet. We went through the morning rituals, coffee, a small gift exchange. I'd bought him a cashmere sweater weeks ago, back when I still thought we had a real marriage. He'd bought me diamond earrings that I later learned cost $6,200 and were charged to one of his secret credit cards. Essentially, he'd bought me a gift with my own money. The irony was almost funny. Around noon, I started preparing the dinner. Stephen hovered nearby, offering to help, clearly unable to settle. He kept checking his phone. I knew he was texting Melissa, probably reassuring her, probably trying to figure out if Thomas's presence was a problem. At one point, his phone buzzed and I saw him read a message. his face going pale. He stepped out onto the back deck to make a call, and through the window I watched him pace, his breath making clouds in the cold air, his free hand gesturing anxiously. I wondered what Melissa was saying to him. Was she having second thoughts? Was she worried? Did she suspect something? When Stephen came back inside, his face was drawn. He asked me one more time if I was absolutely sure about having both Thomas and Melissa there. I was stirring gravy on the stove, and I turned to look at him with the most innocent expression I could manage. Asked him why he kept questioning it, asked if there was some reason he was uncomfortable with Thomas coming. Stephen opened his mouth, closed it, then said no, said he just wanted to make sure I was comfortable. I told him I was perfectly comfortable, that in fact, I'd never been more ready for a dinner party in my life. Something in my tone must have registered because Stephen's eyes narrowed slightly, studying my face like he was trying to read something hidden there. But I'd spent 16 years in corporate operations, managing crisis situations and negotiating with difficult I knew how to control my expression. I knew how to hide what I was really thinking. Stephen had no idea what was coming. The doorbell rang at exactly 5:30 p.m. Thomas, always punctual. I walked to the door with Stephen trailing behind me, and when I opened it, Thomas stood there in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, holding a bottle of wine and looking every inch the successful attorney he was. He smiled warmly at me, kissed my cheek, wished me Merry Christmas. Then he turned to Stephen and extended his hand. I watched them shake hands, two men who had both been married to me, both standing in the foyer of my house. Thomas's grip was firm and confident. Stephen's handshake looked weak by comparison, his palm probably sweating. Thomas complimented the house, mentioned how lovely everything looked, made small talk about the unusual snow. His tone was friendly, casual, giving absolutely no indication of what he really was, a weapon I'd carefully aimed at my husband's throat. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. Melissa, I opened the door and got my first real look at the woman who'd been sleeping with my husband for 2 years, spending my money, planning to take my house. She was beautiful. I had to give her that. Blonde hair in perfect waves, designer red dress that probably costs more than most people's monthly rent, expensive jewelry, flawless makeup. She looked like she'd stepped out of a luxury magazine. She also looked nervous. Her eyes darted past me to where Stephen stood in the hallway, then over to Thomas, who had positioned himself in the living room with a clear view of the entrance. I saw her do a quick calculation, trying to figure out who this tall, distinguished man in the expensive suit was. I invited her in warmly, took her coat, complimented her dress, played the gracious hostess perfectly. Stephen introduced her to Thomas, and I watched her extend her hand, turn on her charm, give him that practiced smile. Thomas shook her hand politely and mentioned that he was my ex-husband. The smile on Melissa's face flickered for just a second. She glanced at Stephen, and I saw confusion in her eyes. Stephen hadn't told her about Thomas. He'd probably been too panicked to mention it. So now, Melissa was walking into what she thought was a simple evaluation dinner, only to find my ex-husband a stranger. She knew nothing about standing in the living room like he belonged there. Perfect. We moved to the dining room, and I'd set the table beautifully. Crystal glasses, fine china, candles, the whole production. If this was going to be a confrontation, I wanted it to look elegant. Thomas took the seat across from Stephen. I'd planned that, specifically. Melissa sat next to Stephen, and I sat next to Thomas. The four of us arranged like chess pieces. I served the first course, a winter salad with pomegranate and goat cheese on. Thomas immediately took control of the conversation. He asked Melissa about herself, where she was from, what she did for work. His tone was friendly, interested, completely non-threatening. Melissa relaxed slightly and started talking about her job in marketing, her apartment downtown, how grateful she was for Stephen's kindness in inviting her. Thomas nodded along, smiling. Then he casually mentioned that he was a divorce attorney. I watched Melissa's fork pause halfway to her mouth. Thomas continued smoothly, talking about how he'd built his practice over the past 20 years, how he specialized in high-asset cases. He said it like he was discussing the weather. Stephen was barely eating, just pushing food around his plate, his eyes locked on Thomas. Then Thomas started telling stories. He mentioned a case from earlier that year, a husband who'd been hiding money offshore, thinking his wife would never find it. Thomas described how satisfying it had been to use forensic accounting to trace every dollar. How the judge had awarded the wife 92% of the marital estate as punishment for the husband's fraud. Melissa's face had gone pale. Thomas told another story, a case where an ex-spouse had conspired with the current spouse to defraud someone. He explained how conspiracy to commit fraud could lead to criminal charges, not just civil liability, how the ex-spouse had ended up losing everything: her house, her car, her savings, paying back what she'd helped steal. Stephen's hand was shaking so badly he had to put down his wineglass. I served the main course, the standing rib roast, perfectly medium rare, with roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes. Everything looked beautiful. Nobody was really eating. Thomas kept talking. He mentioned a recent case where a financial advisor had been stealing from a client, how the advisor had lost his license permanently, how he'd been blacklisted in the industry, how he'd ended up working retail because no one would hire him for anything else. Stephen's face had gone from pale to gray. Melissa tried to change the subject. She brought up Christmas plans, asked about my retirement, complimented the house. Her voice sounded strained, like she was working hard to seem casual. I answered her questions sweetly, playing along, watching Stephen spiral into panic across the table. Thomas mentioned how much he'd enjoyed working with forensic investigators over the years, talked about how amazing modern technology was at finding hidden accounts, secret credit cards, deleted emails, said that people always thought they'd covered their tracks, but digital footprints were nearly impossible to erase completely. At that point, Stephen stood up abruptly, said he needed to use the restroom. His face was sweating despite the cool temperature in the dining room. The second he left, Melissa leaned toward me with a concerned expression, asked if everything was okay. Said Stephen seemed unwell. I smiled at her and said I thought Stephen was just nervous about something, that he'd been acting strange all week. Thomas caught my eye across the table. It was time. When Stephen came back, walking slowly like a man heading to the gallows, I stood up and excused myself to the kitchen, told everyone I'd be right back with dessert. Instead, I went to my study and pulled out the large manila envelope I'd prepared, the one containing every piece of evidence, every photo, every bank statement, every email, every credit card charge. I also grabbed the divorce papers Thomas had prepared, already filled out and ready for Stephen's signature. When I walked back into the dining room carrying that envelope instead of dessert, the expression on Stephen's face told me he knew. He knew that I knew, and he knew that everything was about to end. I placed the envelope on the table in front of him, looked at Melissa, who was staring at it with confusion, looked at Thomas, who gave me a small, supportive nod. Then I spoke, and my voice was steady and cold and absolutely certain. I told him that since we were all being so open this evening, I thought I'd share something too. The silence in that dining room was absolute. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. I could hear the soft hiss of the candles burning. I could hear Stephen's ragged breathing. I opened the envelope, slowly, deliberately. Let them watch as I pulled out the first item, a stack of photographs. I placed them on the table, one by one, like I was dealing cards. The first photo showed Stephen and Melissa having lunch, their hands intertwined across the table. The second showed them kissing in a parking garage. The third showed them entering her apartment building together, Stephen's hand on the small of her back. The fourth showed them at a restaurant I recognized from those secret credit card statements, looking at each other with expressions that made my stomach turn even now. Melissa made a small, choking sound. Stephen just stared at the photos like he was watching his life explode in front of him. I told them I'd been aware of their affair for 3 weeks, that my best friend had spotted them together and had the good sense to document it, that I'd hired a private investigator who'd been extraordinarily thorough. Stephen tried to speak, his mouth opened, but nothing came out except a weak, desperate sound. I pulled out the next set of documents, bank statements showing the transfers to Melissa's investment accounts. I spread them across the table, letting them see the highlighted amounts. $238,000 total. I explained calmly that these were transfers from our joint accounts, money from my retirement, my 28 years of work moved into Melissa's name. I asked Stephen if he remembered telling me those were high-yield investment opportunities for our future. If he remembered me trusting him completely because he was a financial professional. Stephen's face had gone from gray to almost green. He looked like he might vomit right there at my dining table. Then I pulled out the credit card statements, the secret ones sent to the PO box. I read some of the charges out loud. The rent payments for Melissa's apartment, the jewelry, the romantic getaways to San Francisco, Portland, Vancouver, the hotel rooms in Seattle when they couldn't wait to get to her place. Melissa was crying now, mascara starting to run down her carefully made-up face. She kept looking at Stephen like she was waiting for him to fix this, to explain it away, to protect her. But Stephen couldn't protect anyone. He was frozen in his chair, trembling. I pulled out the printed emails next, started reading them aloud. The ones where Stephen told Melissa he couldn't wait to leave me, where he called me boring and controlling, where he calculated how much money they'd have after the divorce, where Melissa talked about redecorating my house, getting rid of my furniture because it was too uptight, just like me. My voice stayed steady as I read, even though each word felt like swallowing glass. I'd practiced this. I'd prepared myself for how much it would hurt to hear these things out loud. Melissa tried to stand up, said she needed to leave. But Thomas spoke for the first time since I'd started the revelation, and his voice had none of the friendly warmth from earlier. It was pure legal authority. He told Melissa to sit down, informed her that as my attorney, he was advising her that leaving now would be seen as an admission of guilt and would not help her position in the civil suit I was filing against her. Melissa collapsed back into her chair, sobbing openly now. I kept going, pulled out the investigation report detailing the timeline of their affair. 2 years, 24 months of systematic betrayal while Stephen kissed me goodnight, told me he loved me, made plans for our future. I explained that I knew about their divorce plan, that I knew the Christmas dinner invitation wasn't charity, it was reconnaissance, that I knew Melissa had come to evaluate what she'd be stealing from me. Then I looked directly at Melissa and told her she'd never live in my house, that she'd never spend another dollar of my money, that in fact, she'd be paying back every single penny Stephen had given her, plus damages, plus interest, plus court costs. Melissa's sobs turned into hyperventilating. She looked at Stephen, gasping out that he'd promised this would work, that he'd said I'd never find out, that he'd said the divorce would be clean and easy. Stephen finally found his voice. It came out as a desperate, pleading whisper. I said my name. Just my name. Like he was asking a question he already knew the answer to. I ignored him. Pulled out more documents. The complaint filed with the Department of Financial Institutions. I explained that Stephen's license as a financial advisor was under investigation for ethics violations, that using marital funds for personal benefit, stealing from a spouse, was exactly the kind of conduct that resulted in permanent license revocation. Stephen's face crumpled. He started to cry, actual tears rolling down his face. He tried to reach for my hand across the table, said we could work this out, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he still loved me. I pulled my hand away like he'd tried to touch me with something diseased. Told him I didn't believe him, that I'd read what he really thought about me, that I knew the only thing he loved was my money. Then I pulled out the final documents, the divorce papers. Thomas leaned forward and explained them professionally. Due to Stephen's dissipation of marital assets and fraud, he would be receiving approximately 8% of our marital estate. That came to roughly $380,000 out of $4.8 million total. The rest over $4.4 million plus our house would be mine. Additionally, Thomas continued, Melissa was being sued for $312,000 in restitution for her role in the conspiracy, plus $200,000 in damages for alienation of affection, plus court costs. Stephen was shaking his head, saying no, like he could deny reality itself. Melissa was rocking in her chair, still crying, looking absolutely destroyed. Thomas told Stephen the papers needed to be signed within 72 hours or he'd file for immediate emergency asset protection, and have all accounts frozen while the case proceeded through court, which would take months and would be much more expensive for everyone. He also mentioned that he'd be pursuing criminal fraud charges if Stephen didn't cooperate completely with the financial investigation. Then Thomas looked at Melissa and told her she needed to retain her own attorney immediately, because the civil suit would be filed by the end of the week. I stood up from the table, looked down at both of them, Stephen crumbling in his chair, Melissa destroyed and sobbing, their beautiful plans scattered across my dining table and documented evidence. I told Stephen he needed to leave tonight, that I wanted him out of my house within 2 hours. Stephen tried to protest, said this was his home too, said I couldn't just throw him out. Thomas calmly informed him that actually, that the house had been purchased primarily with my premarital assets and that under Washington state law, I had every right to exclude him, especially given the documented evidence of his affair and financial fraud. He also mentioned that if Stephen refused to leave voluntarily, Thomas would call the police and have him removed, which would create a police report that could be used in both the divorce proceedings and the professional ethics investigation. Stephen looked at me with devastation in his eyes, had the audacity to say he never meant to hurt me, that things had just gotten complicated, that he still cared about. I told him the only thing he'd ever cared about was my money, and now he'd lost access to almost all of it. Then I told both of them to get out of my house. Melissa practically ran for the door, grabbing her coat, stumbling in her expensive heels, her face a ruin of smeared makeup and tears. Stephen moved slower, like he was in shock. He kept looking around the dining room, the living room, like he was seeing everything for the last time. Which he was. At the front door, he turned back one more time, tried to say something else. I closed the door in his face. Through the window, I watched him walk to his car in the snow, his shoulders slumped, defeated. Watched him sit in the driver's seat for several minutes before finally starting the engine. Watched his taillights disappear down the street. Melissa's car was already gone. When I turned around, Thomas was standing in the hallway, and the expression on his face was something between respect and concern. He asked me if I was okay, and that's when I finally broke. I slid down the wall and started crying, really crying for the first time since I'd found out. All the anger and control I'd maintained for 3 weeks, all the performance and planning and strategy, it all fell away, and I just sobbed. Thomas sat down on the floor next to me and let me cry on his shoulder. Not saying anything, just being present while I finally let myself feel the full weight of what had been done to me. My marriage was over. The man I'd trusted for 16 years had spent 2 of them systematically betraying me. The life I'd thought we were building together had been a lie, but I'd also just taken back my power. I'd exposed the truth. I'd protected my assets and my future. They won. It just hurt a lot more than I'd expected winning to hurt. The divorce was finalized in exactly 63 days. Stephen signed the papers without fighting. I think Thomas's threat of criminal charges and the professional ethics investigation broke whatever resistance he might have had. Or maybe seeing all that evidence laid out had finally made him realize he had no defense, no leverage, no way to spin the narrative in his favor. He moved into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of Seattle. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was sleeping on an air mattress and driving a 10-year-old Honda because most of his portion of the settlement went to legal fees and the initial payment toward what he owed me in restitution. The Department of Financial Institutions completed their investigation in 4 months. They revoked his license permanently. The report cited breach of fiduciary duty, misuse of client funds, and conduct unbecoming of a financial professional. It was a matter of public record, which meant any potential employer could see exactly why he'd lost his career. Last I heard, Stephen was working at an electronics store, selling phones and laptops to customers who had no idea he'd once managed million-dollar portfolios. Melissa's situation was even worse. She'd tried to fight the civil suit at first, hired a lawyer who looked at the evidence for approximately 20 minutes before advising her to settle. The problem was, she didn't have $512,000. She barely had $50,000 in actual liquid assets. Thomas was relentless. He filed liens against everything she owned. Her car was repossessed. Her apartment was liquidated. Her bank accounts were frozen and emptied. She tried to declare bankruptcy, But Thomas had structured the judgment in a way that made it non-dischargeable because it involved fraud, which meant she'd be paying it off for years, probably decades. I heard she moved back to wherever she'd come from originally, some small town in Oregon. Heard she was working 2 jobs trying to make the monthly payments Thomas's office had mandated. Heard that she and Stephen had tried to maintain their relationship for about 3 months after everything exploded, but the financial pressure and mutual blame destroyed whatever they'd had. She ended up blaming him for not protecting her. He ended up blaming her for being too obvious, too greedy. Their great love story, the one they'd risked everything for, lasted exactly 97 days after the money disappeared. Turns out the relationship had been built entirely on my funding. As for me, I spent the first few months after the divorce just processing everything. Some days I was angry, some days I was sad. Some days I felt nothing at all, just numb and empty. Thomas checked in on me regularly. We'd have dinner once a week, and he'd make sure I was eating, sleeping, taking care of myself. He never judged me for the bad days. Never told me to get over it faster. Just sat with me while I worked through the grief of losing someone who'd never really existed. Because that was the hardest part, realizing that the Stephen I'd loved, the marriage I'd believed in, had been fiction. The real Stephen was someone I'd never actually known. Around month 4, something shifted. I woke up one morning and realized I hadn't thought about Stephen in 2 whole days. I'd been busy planning a trip to Italy, something I'd always wanted to do but had never made time for. And for 2 days, I'd been so focused on researching hotels and restaurants and museums that my ex-husband hadn't even crossed my mind. That felt like progress. I took that trip to Italy, spent 3 weeks eating incredible food, seeing beautiful art, walking through ancient streets. I traveled alone, which I'd never done before, and discovered I actually enjoyed my own company. I came back feeling lighter, stronger. Like maybe I was finally becoming myself again. Thomas and I continued our dinners, but they evolved into something more than just check. We'd talk about books, politics, travel, life. We'd laugh about things that had nothing to do with my divorce. We'd argue playfully about movies and restaurants. One evening, about 8 months after that Christmas dinner, Thomas looked at me across the table and told me I seemed happy. I realized he was right. I was happy, maybe not the same kind of happy I'd been when I thought my marriage was real, but something deeper. Something that came from knowing I could trust myself, that I could handle crises, that I could fight for what was mine. I'd survived betrayal and come out stronger. Thomas asked me if I'd thought about dating again, said he knew some decent men who'd be lucky to take me to dinner. I told him maybe someday, but for now I was enjoying rediscovering who I was outside of being someone's wife. He smiled and said that was probably the healthiest thing I could do. But then he added something that surprised me. He said that when I was ready, if I ever wanted to try again with someone who already knew me, already respected me, and had already proven he'd fight alongside me rather than against me, his schedule was pretty open. I stared at him for a long moment. Thomas, my ex-husband from 20 years ago, the man who'd helped me dismantle my current husband's life, the man who'd sat on the floor with me while I cried, the man who'd checked in on me every week for 8 months. I told him that was the strangest proposition I'd ever received. He laughed and said it was probably too weird, that we should forget he'd mentioned it, but I didn't forget it. 3 months later, Thomas and I went to dinner at a new restaurant downtown. It felt different than our usual dinners. We'd both dressed up a little more carefully. The conversation felt charged with something new. At the end of the night, he walked me to my car, and we stood there in the parking garage for a moment. Snow starting to fall again, and he asked if he could kiss me. I said yes. It felt nothing like kissing Stephen. It felt like coming home to something I'd forgotten existed. We took it slow. Really slow. Both of us had been burned by marriage before him by 2 divorces, me by spectacular betrayal. Neither of us was in a hurry to rush into anything, but over the following year, Thomas became a constant presence in my life. Not as a husband, not as a savior, just as a partner, someone who saw me clearly, respected my independence, and chose to stand beside me rather than trying to control or use me. We traveled together, took cooking classes, hosted dinner parties, built something new that that belonged to just us. On the 2-year anniversary of that Christmas dinner, Thomas and I were sitting in my living room, the same room where he'd told those strategic stories about fraud cases, where the confrontation had begun. He asked me if I'd learned anything from the whole nightmare. I thought about it for a long time, told him I'd learned that trust should be earned, not given blindly, that financial independence is sacred and should never be compromised, that when someone shows you who they really are, believe them. But mostly, I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd ever known, that I could face betrayal and not just survive it, but emerge from it more whole than before. Thomas said that was exactly the right lesson. Then he told me he'd learned something too, that some love stories don't work the first time because the timing is wrong or the people aren't ready. But that doesn't mean they can't work the second time around. Years later, after both people have grown into who they're meant to be, I asked him if he was talking about us. He smiled and said he might be. 3 years after my divorce from Stephen, I'm living the life I was supposed to have all along. I still live in my house, the one Melissa thought she'd read. I still have my retirement money, that $4.4 million Stephen tried to steal. I still have my independence, the thing I'll never risk again. But I also have something I didn't expect to find. A relationship built on honesty, respect, and shared history, with a man who proved he'd stand with me at my absolute worst moment and help me fight my way back to the light. Stephen sends me an email once a year around the holidays. I never open them. I have them automatically forwarded to a folder I never check. Thomas tells me I should just block him completely, but I like knowing they're accumulating somewhere, unread and irrelevant. It feels like a small, petty victory, and I'm okay with that. Melissa stopped making her monthly payments about a year ago, declared bankruptcy again, and this time it worked because enough time had passed. Thomas said I could pursue additional legal action, but I told him to let it go. She'd lost her home, her car, her relationship, and her dignity. That felt like enough. Sometimes I think about that Christmas dinner, about the moment I walked back into the dining room with that envelope, about the look on Stephen's face when he realized his perfect plan had fallen apart. I don't regret any of it. When someone casually invites their ex to Christmas dinner and calls it charity, pay attention. When your instincts tell you something is wrong, investigate it. When you discover betrayal, don't collapse. And if you're lucky enough to have an ex-husband who happens to be a divorce attorney specializing in financial fraud, definitely invite him to dinner. Stephen thought I'd be passive, thought I'd be too trusting, too naive, too weak to fight back. He was wrong about all of it. I fought back. I won, and I built a better life on the ruins of his betrayal. That's my story, the story of how a casual invitation to Christmas dinner became the catalyst for the most satisfying revenge of my life. To everyone out there who's been betrayed, stolen from, underestimated, you're stronger than you know, fight for what's yours. Protect yourself, and never, ever let someone take your power, because when you stand up for yourself, when you refuse to be a victim, when you dismantle the plans of people who thought they could use you, that's not revenge. That's justice. And justice feels pretty damn good. Now, I want to hear from you. If you've made it this far through my story, if you've witnessed this whole journey with me, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I'd love to know where all of you are, what your stories are. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about people who fought back, who refused to be victims, who turned their pain into power, make sure you're following along, because there are so many more stories to tell, and I think you'll want to hear them. Thank you for being here with me through this. Thank you for witnessing my story. Thank you for letting me share the hardest and proudest moment of my life. This was Caroline Masters, signing off from Seattle, reminding you that sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the courage to fight for what's yours.